My daughter and her new husband kicked me out of the house because I was in their way. But they didn't know I was hiding $10 million. I suppose I always knew my daughter would choose someone else's comfort over my dignity. I just didn't think she'd do it so easily, or so quickly. The day she and her new husband told me I was getting in the way of their life together, standing there in my own kitchen, still holding the tea I'd just poured for her, I understood something with final clarity. They didn't see me anymore. Not really. I had become an object in the house I built, a sentimental fixture, a guest who had overstayed her welcome. It wasn't said with cruelty, not exactly. That would have been easier to fight. No, it came wrapped in pleasantries, gentle smiles, phrases like, "You've done enough," and "It's time for us to take over now." As if my presence were a piece of furniture they were gently asking the movers to carry out. And I stood there, blinking, nodding, hearing their words, but not yet feeling their meaning. The cup trembled in my hand, not from anger, but from the realization that I had been erased without resistance. I hadn't always lived with them, of course. For most of my life, I had carried myself, paid my way, kept my own schedule, never leaned too hard. But after Harold passed and the house grew too big for one person, it was Emily who suggested I move in. "It'll be good for all of us," she had said. "You'll have company, and we'll have help." And I believed her, or maybe I just wanted to. So I sold the house I had shared with her father for 32 years. I left behind the rose bushes I planted every spring, the kitchen with the warped tile we never got around to fixing, the closet still lined with Harold's old flannel shirts. I packed a lifetime into boxes and moved into the in-law suite her new husband had graciously remodeled for me. It was fine, cozy, but it wasn't mine. At first I didn't mind. I told myself I was being useful. I babysat the children, cooked the meals, even handled their laundry when the work schedules piled up. I told myself I was giving them a head start, the kind of support young couples needed. But gradually, something shifted. I began to notice the glances, the way he winced when I entered a room mid-conversation, the way she spoke to me like I was a responsibility rather than a mother. Small things at first, but unmistakable. The final blow came 3 weeks after they returned from their honeymoon, a trip they paid for, using the money I gave them as a wedding gift. I thought it would bring us closer. I thought they would come home with stories, gratitude, maybe even affection. Instead, they came home full of plans, new furniture, new schedules, a new life that didn't include me. "We've been talking," Emily said, placing her hand on mine like it still meant something. "And we think it might be time for you to consider other arrangements." "Other arrangements," I repeated, as if the words were in a language I didn't speak. "Just somewhere that feels more yours," she added quickly. "You deserve your own space, Mom. We want to help you find that." But there was no plan to help, no offer, no timeline, just the soft cruelty of implication. I was a hindrance, a wrinkle in their new beginning. And the worst part was, I had no legal claim. I had given everything freely, naively, thinking love would shield me from being discarded. I packed my things the next morning. They didn't even help. I heard laughter upstairs while I folded my sweaters into suitcases. I moved slowly, methodically, taking only what I needed. The photos I couldn't leave behind. A box of old letters. The quilt Harold's mother had made for our wedding. But what they didn't know, what they had never thought to ask, was that I had not given away everything. Tucked safely away, in a separate account they didn't know existed, was a sum of money I hadn't touched in decades. Money from Harold's business, which I had invested quietly and wisely over the years. I never spoke of it. Not because I was hiding it, but because I believed, foolishly, that I would never need to protect myself from my own daughter. $10 million, untouched, undisclosed, and mine. I left that house with no farewell and no fanfare, just a bag in my hand and the echo of their voices upstairs. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry. I walked out as calmly as I had walked in, because I knew, in a way they never would, that this story wasn't over. They thought they had cast me out, but they had, without knowing it, freed me. And I was about to remind them what happens when you push someone who built her life in silence and strength. I found a small, quiet rental on the edge of town, the kind of place no one would look twice at. White siding, uneven stone steps, and a screened-in porch that creaked underfoot like an old friend whispering secrets. The landlord, an older woman with cloud-white hair and a raspy laugh, didn't ask questions when I paid for 6 months in cash. She handed me the keys, offered a gentle nod, and said, "Sometimes peace is worth more than square footage." I liked her immediately. The house was nothing like the one I'd left. It had no polished granite countertops, no vaulted ceilings, no curated lighting. But it had light. Real light. The kind that poured in through uncurtained windows and spread across the floor like a warm hand on your shoulder. I unpacked only what I needed. Clothes, a kettle, a notebook, a few framed photos of Harold. The one where we're sitting on the porch at the lake, both of us squinting into the sun, laughing at nothing in particular. For the first few days, I barely spoke aloud. My voice, when I did hear it, felt strange in the air, like it belonged to someone else. But I moved slowly through the rooms, reclaiming space. Each drawer I filled, each shelf I dusted, became an act of defiance. I wasn't mourning the loss of comfort. I was rediscovering the kind of comfort that doesn't come from square footage or proximity to family, but from sovereignty. I didn't tell anyone where I was, not Emily, not her husband, not even my sons, not out of spite, but out of necessity. For the first time in years, I wasn't performing. I wasn't smoothing over conflict or managing emotions. I was simply being. And in that stillness, a clarity began to rise in me like mist lifting off a morning field. I remembered, with startling precision, the day Harold first showed me the account. A modest investment back then, just the beginnings of a portfolio he'd started building in his 30s. He had looked at me with quiet pride, as if offering me a secret. "This is for us," he had said. "But if something ever happens, I want you to know exactly where it is." And I had. Over the years, I had tended to that account with the same care I gave to our home and children. I had reinvested dividends, watched markets, learned more than I ever let on. By the time Harold died, that portfolio had grown into something astonishing. $10 million scattered across a conservative mosaic of mutual funds, blue-chip stocks, and bonds. I never touched it. Not even when Emily struggled in college. Not even when Harold's medical bills came in thick envelopes with red stamps. I always found another way, because that money, in some quiet, unspoken way, became my spine. Not as a tool of control, but as a promise that I would never be at the mercy of anyone who mistook my kindness for weakness. They had no idea. Emily assumed I'd used every dime to help her, that my gift for the wedding, a down payment on their house, thousands spent on the ceremony, my presence in the kitchen every morning, had emptied me. Her husband, smug and small-minded, seemed to delight in the idea that they had liberated me from some outdated role. They thought I had nowhere to go, nothing left to offer, that I had aged into irrelevance, like furniture you keep for sentiment, but eventually send to the garage. But while they were busy decorating their new life with my money, I was making a plan. Not out of revenge. I had no interest in destruction. I didn't want to scream or sue or shame them. I had no appetite for legal battles or drawn-out feuds. What I wanted was simple: to reclaim my name, my choices, my future, and to do it so quietly that when they finally noticed I was gone, it would be too late to ask where I'd gone or why. I began to make moves. I met with a financial advisor under a different name, a retired woman from a neighboring town whose records were clean and discreet. I rented a private mailbox, bought a used car in cash, began transferring funds strategically, quietly, in increments just beneath reporting thresholds. Everything legal, everything careful. I set up a trust, drafted new documents, appointed a power of attorney from outside the family. I didn't want anyone in my bloodline tied to my legacy until they had proven themselves capable of seeing me as more than a wallet with wrinkles. And while I did all of this, I lived. I walked each morning through the wooded paths behind the cottage, learning the names of birds by their calls. I cooked for myself, not rushed meals between chores, but real food, savoured, chosen. I wrote longhand letters I never sent. I read books I had meant to read for years. I tended a small garden of herbs and wildflowers. I reminded myself that I was still here, not as a leftover, not as a burden, but as a woman with years ahead of her, and something they would never again mistake for weakness: independence. The day I received the final confirmation of my asset transfers, I sat on the porch and let myself feel the weight of it. I was free, not because they let me go, but because I had chosen to walk away, and they would never know what they lost until they needed me and found only silence. March moved across the landscape like an old friend returning after a long absence, unhurried, gentle, and full of quiet intentions. Rain tapped against the windows at night, not in anger, but like a reminder that something was being washed away. I began to move through the days with a kind of sacred patience, no longer measuring time by what needed to be done, but by how fully I could be present inside it. The rituals I built were not complicated. I boiled water for tea the old way. I folded towels with care. I opened the windows, even when the wind was sharp, just to feel the cold on my skin. Each act felt like a ceremony of return, not to a place, but to myself. And still, I thought of Emily. Not often. But when I did, it came like a ripple, not a wave. There was no bitterness anymore, only clarity. I could see now how she had been shaped by the very habits I had taught her. All those years I spent swallowing words, saying yes instead of no, putting others ahead of myself in the name of love. She had absorbed them as truths, not sacrifices. She had mistaken endurance for duty and my silence for permission. And when she married a man who valued ownership over respect, she assumed I would stay quiet again, that I would bend, as I always had, to make space. But the difference now was that I had no more space to give. I had filled it, finally, with myself. I began to travel modestly, nothing extravagant. Weekend trips to towns I'd always meant to visit, quiet inns tucked into hills, roadside cafes where no one knew my name. I went not to escape, but to expand. I wrote in my journal each morning, not for catharsis, but for memory. I wanted to remember what it felt like to walk through a museum alone, to speak to strangers without the weight of expectation, to eat dessert first, simply because I could. Everywhere I went, I observed how rarely people noticed women like me. Grey-haired, modestly dressed, alone. We move through the world invisible until we decide not to be. That invisibility, once painful, had become a tool. It allowed me to listen more than I spoke, to learn things people said freely when they thought no one was really listening. It gave me access. It gave me power. One afternoon, while sitting in a quiet garden behind a converted mill in a town 2 hours north, I met a woman named Charlotte. She was in her late 60s, traveling alone too. We exchanged small pleasantries, shared a bench, and ended up talking for 3 hours. She told me how she had left her marriage after 42 years, how she sold the house and bought a sailboat she didn't know how to operate, just to prove to herself she could learn. There was no sadness in her voice, only calm. At one point, she asked if I had children. I nodded. She asked if I saw them often. I hesitated. Then I said, no. And not because I live far away. She didn't press. Instead, she looked at me with a gaze that was neither pitying nor surprised. I suppose we all become ghosts in our children's stories at some point, she said. The only question is whether we haunt them or set ourselves free. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words had settled somewhere deep inside me, not as sorrow, but as confirmation. I had already made my choice. To stop haunting a family that no longer made room for me. To stop waiting for recognition that would never come in the form I hoped for. But I had not yet decided what to do with the freedom that followed. So I started writing again. Not journals, not letters, but something closer to a reckoning. A long manuscript, half memoir, half instruction, for no one and for everyone. I wrote about what it meant to give your best years to people who never looked up from their own needs. I wrote about the quiet rage of being thanked with a sigh, the sharp pain of being told you're too much when all you've done is stay. I wrote about money, not the dollars and cents of it, but the dignity it could buy when used carefully, when held with purpose. I wrote about what it meant to have power in a world that treats older women like relics. And somewhere along the way, the writing turned into something else. A map. Not a revenge fantasy. Not a list of grievances. But a guide. A record of how I had disappeared and returned. It was around that time that I learned through a neighbour, not Emily herself, that she and her husband were facing financial strain. He had lost his job in a quiet scandal, and the renovations they had planned for the house had halted mid-project. She had taken on extra hours, begun tutoring from home. The subtle signs of strain were everywhere. Fewer social posts, clipped conversations, the thinning smile when spotted in the grocery store. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't smirk. I felt distance. They didn't know, of course, that I was aware. They didn't know that I still held the deed to the original family plot out by the lake. A parcel of land her husband had once mocked as useless dirt when I offered it as part of their honeymoon fund. They didn't know it had since been rezoned for development. They didn't know that several buyers had quietly inquired after it, and that I had politely declined. Because that land was never for them. It was mine now, fully and clearly, like everything else they had once tried to manage. I was not petty. I didn't interfere. I didn't gloat. I simply let them live with the reality they had chosen, one in which the woman they dismissed now held more security, more peace, and more power than they could fathom. And if the day ever came when they came knocking, asking for help, well, I had already begun writing the answer. And it began not with anger, not with sorrow, but with a single sentence written calmly at the top of the page. There is a cost to forgetting who raised you. By late spring, the air had changed, not just in temperature but in tone, the way it moved through the trees, softer now, no longer cutting but coaxing. The garden I'd planted when I first arrived at the cottage had begun to bloom, unevenly, in the way untamed things do. Lavender, chamomile, a few scraggly vines of tomato that refused to follow the stakes I'd placed. I let them grow wild. I understood now that discipline wasn't always necessary for beauty to emerge. Some things needed space to sprawl before they knew where they belonged. My days were filled, but not in the way they used to be. I no longer structured my time around usefulness. I had spent decades quantifying my worth in terms of what I could give: meals prepared, favors granted, silences maintained. Now I measured days by presence: how often I had sat still, how fully I had tasted my lunch, how much of the sky I had noticed before noon. One afternoon, as I was turning soil near the porch, I received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, though I hadn't seen it in years. Emily's, uneven and slightly rushed, a style I'd once corrected on homework assignments while she pouted across the table. I held the envelope for a long moment before opening it, uncertain whether I was ready to hear what it contained. But the moment I broke the seal, I knew it wasn't an apology. It was a request. She wrote of difficulty, of how things had changed, how her husband's situation had worsened, how the house needed repairs they couldn't afford. She mentioned the land by the lake, casually, as if we had spoken about it recently, and asked whether I might consider transferring ownership, just to help stabilize things. She did not mention the day they asked me to leave. She did not refer to the silence that followed. She wrote as if I had never gone. I sat with the letter for several days, placing it beside my journal each night, then folding it back into its envelope without response. There was no anger in me, none that required release, only a deep, unwavering sense of boundary. The kind of boundary you only earn after your own family teaches you that love, when conditional, is not love at all. I never replied. Instead, I returned to my writing, more focused now. I began shaping the manuscript into something more formal, organizing the chapters, smoothing the transitions. It was no longer just a record of loss. It had become a document of transformation, a slow, deliberate mapping of a woman who had been removed from her place and decided not to beg for re-entry, but to build a new life from the ground up. In early May, I was invited to speak at a local gathering, not a literary event this time, but a panel on financial literacy for women over 60. A woman from the community centre had read a section of my draft and passed it along. I hesitated before accepting, not because I feared public speaking, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to offer my story to people who might recognize pieces of it in their own families. But in the end, I said yes. The event was small: folding chairs, a plastic table, pitchers of lemon water. But the women who filled those chairs listened with the hunger of those who have spent too many years being told to wait, to be polite, to shrink. I spoke not just of money, but of ownership, not just of accounts and estates, but of time and space and self. When I finished, one woman stood and said, "I didn't know I was allowed to think of myself that way." I did not tell her she had always been allowed. I told her she no longer needed permission. That afternoon, I walked home slower than usual. Not because I was tired, but because something in me had shifted. I had spent years reclaiming my finances, my peace, my voice. But this was the first time I felt I had been restored. Not to who I was before, but to someone fuller. Someone I had never had time to become. And then, one morning not long after, as the birds began their low, urgent songs just before sunrise, I woke with a certainty I hadn't expected. It was time to write my will. Not out of fear, not in response to any decline or diagnosis, but because I wanted to put things in place with intention, not as a reaction, but as a final act of authorship. I made an appointment with a lawyer in town, a woman recommended by Charlotte. I arrived with a clear outline: the trust, the investments, the land, the manuscripts. Everything was to go to organizations and individuals who had moved toward me when I was no longer useful to others. Not out of charity, but out of alignment. Emily was not included. Neither was her husband. There was no malice in the omission, only accuracy. My legacy was not a reward. It was a continuation. And I would not leave it in the hands of those who had already shown they did not value what I had built. Later that day, as I returned to the cottage, I passed by the lake road. The land was quiet. The trees stood undisturbed, the wild grass dancing in the breeze. I pulled over, walked its edge, and stood for a long while without moving. This place, once dismissed as useless dirt, had become my altar. It was the soil from which I had grown something unshakable, a life that belonged to me. By early June, the landscape had softened into the fullness of summer, thick with green, the air fragrant with honeysuckle and distant smoke from someone's slow-burning fire. The days stretched long into the evening, and I often found myself awake well past dusk, sitting on the porch in the twilight, bare feet against the worn wood, a glass of cool water in my hand. I no longer kept track of time by clocks or calendars. My life was measured in cycles of light and sound: the birdsong that stirred at dawn, the quiet stillness that blanketed the yard after 9, the creak of the screen door as I stepped out each morning just to feel the air. I had begun to host dinners again, though this time for no one I was related to by blood. The women from the centre, Charlotte when she passed through town, a couple from the library who shared my fondness for poetry and roasted fennel. They came with wine, with stories, with laughter that filled the little house in ways it had not known in years. We didn't talk about children or husbands unless the stories were funny. We didn't offer each other solutions. We listened. We passed dishes and silence with equal reverence. These evenings felt like repair, not to the past, that was already settled, but to the shape of companionship I had once believed was only for the young. And through it all, I continued writing. The manuscript took on a form I hadn't anticipated, less like a memoir, more like a map, not a story of what had been done to me, but of what I had done with it. It spoke of betrayal, yes, but more of rebuilding, of how a life can be restarted not from nothing, but from fragments arranged with care and clarity. I didn't write to be read. I wrote to anchor myself. Still, I submitted excerpts to small publishers, never expecting much. Then one day, a letter came. Not a form rejection, but an acceptance. Simple, respectful, professional. They wanted to publish it. All of it. I didn't tell anyone right away. Not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to hold it privately, like a quiet flame. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about having written something that would remain, even after I did not. A few weeks later, Emily called. Her number lit up my phone like a memory I hadn't summoned. I let it ring twice before answering. My voice was steady, polite. Hers was tentative, falsely cheerful, the tone of someone trying to pretend that nothing terrible had ever happened. She asked how I was. I answered simply. She asked where I was living. I told her it was peaceful. She asked, eventually, awkwardly, if I would consider meeting for coffee. I declined. Not cruelly, not with anger, but with honesty. I think, I said, you're hoping for something I no longer need to give. She was quiet. Then came the inevitable question. Why are you still angry? I'm not, I said. but I've learned that peace requires boundaries. And that was true. I didn't want to argue, to explain, to excavate the past. I didn't want to be pulled back into a version of myself that waited to be invited, that accepted crumbs of respect in exchange for love that should have been unconditional. I had created a life that no longer needed her approval or her apologies. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the fading light, my hands resting quietly in my lap. I felt no triumph, no guilt, only the confirmation that I had made the right decision, that staying gone was sometimes the most courageous form of presence. Not long after, I took a trip to the coast, a small cottage for rent on the edge of a cliff, with a view of the sea that stretched wide and grey and endless. I walked each morning with my shoes in hand, the cold water biting at my ankles, the sky above me shifting from mist to light and back again. I thought often of Harold then, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. It had been his quiet trust, his patient stewardship of our finances, that made this freedom possible. But more than that, it had been the space he left me when he passed. Not an absence, but an opening. On my final morning there, I stood at the edge of the bluff and watched the sun rise clean from the ocean. It felt like something was being completed. Not a chapter, not even a book, but a sentence. One I had been writing in fragments for years. I didn't need anyone to hear it. I only needed to know it had been said. When I returned home, I set the final edits of my manuscript in motion. I reviewed the layout, approved the cover. Nothing dramatic, just a plain, clean title and a quiet design. The book would be printed in the fall. I didn't plan a launch. I didn't want attention. I wanted permanence. Later that week, I visited the lake once more. The land, untouched and wild, welcomed me like a place that remembered everything. I walked the perimeter slowly, touching the bark of the same trees I had once passed as a younger woman, back when I still believed gratitude meant never asking for more. I stood still in the center clearing, eyes closed, and breathed until I no longer felt time. The land was mine, not just on paper, but in soul. It had been claimed through resilience, not revenge, through patience, not power. And I knew then what I would do with it. Not sell, not develop, not pass down. I would preserve it. In my will, I would write the clearest sentence of my life. Let this remain untouched. Because some things are not meant to be converted into usefulness. Some things are sacred only when left alone. Just like a woman who has finally stopped explaining herself. By the time August arrived, the air had thickened with the stillness that only deep summer can bring. The afternoons stretched themselves lazily over the land, and the evenings came down in golden silence, warm and slow like honey slipping down a spoon. In that suspended light, I found myself reflecting not just on what I had rebuilt, but on who I had become in the process, not as a role, not as someone's mother or widow or displaced elder, but as a complete person with a rhythm entirely her own. The manuscript was officially in production. My publisher, a small independent house run by a thoughtful woman named Corinne, had approached the project with respect, not spectacle. We spoke rarely, but when we did, it was with mutual understanding. That this book was not meant to be flashy, that it was not for everyone, and that its value lay in the space between the sentences, in what was withheld as much as in what was told. When she sent me the first advance copy, I held it in my lap for nearly half an hour before opening it. The cover was simple, as I had requested. A soft linen texture, my name in understated type, the title alone in lowercase letters. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I simply placed it on the small shelf beside my bed, where it sat not as a trophy, but as a record. That same week, I received another letter, this time from a lawyer in town representing Emily and her husband. Not aggressive, not demanding, just a bland, professionally worded inquiry as to whether I might be willing to engage in a discussion about potential inheritance matters and asset considerations. The language was scrubbed clean of emotion, but the intent was unmistakable. They had begun to realize what they had lost. I did not respond. Instead, I contacted my own attorney and requested that we finalize every aspect of my estate, down to the smallest clause. The trust was revised to ensure airtight control. The literary rights to my book were placed in a foundation under my name, designed to fund scholarships for women over 50 returning to school. The land by the lake was legally declared a protected reserve. No construction, no sale, no transfer. And perhaps most satisfyingly of all, I left a single instruction to be delivered posthumously to Emily. A letter, handwritten, concise, and unambiguous. I had rewritten the story, and now I would write its closing chapters on my terms. In the days that followed, I returned to my routines. The world, after all, does not stop for clarity. The dishes still needed washing. The garden still needed weeding. The local library had requested I host a small reading, and though I was hesitant, I agreed. Not for recognition, but for the quiet women who might be sitting in those chairs, waiting for someone to say aloud what they had only dared to whisper inside. At the event, the room was small but full. I read a section from the final chapter, the part where the protagonist, having been cast out, builds a home not made of walls or possessions, but of choices, a place where no one else's expectations could find a foothold. When I finished, no one applauded. They simply sat in silence, the kind that feels sacred rather than awkward. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't known I was still waiting for: release. On the way home, Thomas met me at the gate. We didn't live together. We had agreed early on that love didn't require merging, but he had stayed close, orbiting my world with a gentleness that neither imposed nor retreated. He held out a small bag with apricots and bread from the market, then followed me inside without a word. We ate in the kitchen, not discussing the reading or the letter or anything at all. We just were. And that was enough. Later, as he prepared to leave, he turned at the door and said, "You look like you finally came home." "I did," I said, and I meant it. But it wasn't a return to what had been. It was a claiming of what I had never been given permission to hold. That night, I sat once more on the porch. The wind had shifted, and I could smell the lake from miles away. It carried the memory of summers long gone, of Harold, of childhood laughter, of moments too soft to be recaptured but not forgotten. I didn't try to name them. I just let them pass through me, like wind through the screen door. And I knew then, with a finality that didn't sting but soothed, that I had already received the only apology I would ever get. Not from Emily, not in words, but in the shape of the life I had built in her absence. She had given me a gift without knowing it. By removing me, she had returned me to myself. And I, in turn, had built something she would never understand, because it wasn't made for admiration. It was made for peace. September arrived not with thunder or wind, but with a slow hush that settled over everything. The days began to shorten almost imperceptibly at first. A shift in the angle of light, a cooler breath in the mornings that lingered just long enough to remind you that nothing holds its shape forever. Even the trees seemed to sigh more deeply, their green edges softening into gold as if in quiet surrender. I had always loved this season best. It was the time when the world, having bloomed and burned through summer, finally sat still enough to listen to itself. The cottage seemed to absorb the mood. I opened fewer windows. The evenings, once spent outside with a book or my thoughts, now found me curled into the armchair by the fire, a wool blanket across my knees, the soft hum of the old radio playing classical music in the background. I had never understood the comfort of silence until I stopped fearing it. Now, it felt like a presence, the only one I never had to explain myself to. The publication date of the book came and went without ceremony. A small box of copies arrived on my porch one morning, stacked neatly with a polite note from the publisher. I carried them inside and placed them on a shelf, untouched for several days. It wasn't until Charlotte called, voice thrilled, breathless, that I opened one. "I read it in one sitting," she said. "It's not just your story, it's ours." I didn't reply. I just pressed the phone to my cheek and let her voice settle over me like an old song. I hadn't realized how deeply I'd longed to be seen. Not as someone's mother, not as a woman wronged, but as someone who had survived without spectacle. The reviews, though modest in number, were thoughtful and reverent. Women, older mostly, wrote to me through the publisher or reached out through local libraries. Their letters were full of underlined sentences, pages dog-eared and worn. One woman from Minnesota said reading my book felt like walking through a house she had once been locked out of, only to discover the key had been in her pocket the entire time. And still, I told almost no one in my family, because they were not my audience. Not anymore. One afternoon, while reorganizing the shelf in the study, I came across an old family album I hadn't touched since moving out. The leather was cracked along the spine, and the photographs inside had begun to fade around the edges, softening like memory. There was Emily as a toddler, chubby fingers in the cake batter. Harold with his arm around me at the lake. The boys lined up in matching corduroy overalls I'd sewn by hand. Each image a moment I had once lived fully, with a love that expected nothing in return. And yet, when I closed the album, I felt no need to open it again. The past had not been erased, but it had been placed where it belonged, behind me. Later that week, I received another envelope. This time, not from lawyers, not unsigned. It was Emily's handwriting again. Tighter this time, more deliberate. I opened it slowly, not out of hesitation, but with the steady hand of someone who no longer feared being reopened. She wrote that they were moving, downsizing, that things had not gone as planned. There was no direct request, no overt manipulation. But the implication hung heavy between the lines. She wanted help. Or perhaps, more accurately, she wanted reassurance. That no matter how she had acted, I would always be there. I placed the letter on the desk and left it there for 3 days. On the 4th morning, I tore it in half and fed it to the fire. Not because I hated her, but because I loved myself enough not to be reduced again. Some may call that harsh, but I have learned that boundaries, once drawn in blood, must be enforced with fire, not to harm, but to purify. That evening I sat by the lake again, the land still mine, still wild. The trees bent gently in the breeze, and the tall grass moved like water beneath the wind. I thought of all the things I had once begged for: acknowledgement, affection, inclusion. None of them had been wrong to want, but they had been misplaced. You cannot force those who do not see you to look closer. You can only step out of the line of their indifference and let them miss you, or not. In the quiet that followed, I made peace with something final, that there would be no reunion, no neatly tied ending where we all sit around a table and laugh at the past. Life doesn't owe us reconciliation. It offers us something better: clarity. And with that clarity, I had written a life worth reading. Not perfect, not painless, but true. As the light faded and the first stars blinked through the blue, I stood slowly and turned back toward the cottage. My steps were slow, deliberate. I was not walking away from anything. I was walking toward the life I had built, with hands no longer trembling. And I knew, without doubt, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. By the time October set in, the world outside my windows had turned a deep amber, trees painted with fire, the ground soft with leaves, the air carrying that unmistakable scent of endings. I had always loved the fall, not just for its beauty, but for its honesty. It's the only season that doesn't pretend. It lets go without apology. I had learned to do the same. The house was quiet, as it always was, but now that silence held a different weight. Not emptiness, but peace. I had built a world inside these walls that needed nothing from anyone. I made my breakfast slowly, ate by the window, watched the wind play with the last of the garden. I answered letters from women I'd never met. Readers who found pieces of themselves in the pages I had written without knowing I would ever share them. Some were angry, some grieving, but all were waking up. And I, in turn, began to realize that what I had created was no longer just mine. It belonged to them too, to every woman who had been asked to disappear quietly. I did not hear from Emily again. Not after the second letter. Not after the legal silence that followed. I imagined she had received word through back channels, her lawyer perhaps, or someone from the bank, that I had made my decisions final. And that must have stung, in some quiet way. Not because I withheld resources, but because I withheld access. The door she had assumed would always stand open, no matter how she exited it, was now closed. Not slammed, not locked, just closed, and no longer hers to enter. I had a dream that week, a strange one, vivid and full of symbols I couldn't quite name. I was walking through the house we used to share, not the cottage, but the one I left behind. Every room was empty, stripped bare, walls white, floors cold, not a single sound. But when I reached the kitchen, I found a small envelope on the table. Inside it, nothing. Just the weight of paper in my hands, and the sensation that someone had left it there hoping I'd find meaning in the absence. I woke before dawn, and instead of going back to sleep, I lit a candle and sat at the kitchen table in my robe, notebook open. I didn't try to interpret the dream. I just wrote until the sky shifted. The pages filled with something different that morning. Not memory, not instruction, but presence. I was no longer writing to process the past. I was writing to hold the now, and the now was good. There were moments of grief, of course. Nothing this full is without shadows. Some mornings, I missed Harold's quiet cough in the next room. Some evenings, I thought of what it might have been like to hold a grandchild without feeling like I was overstepping. I missed things I had never been given the chance to experience. And that, I learned, is a grief too. Not the loss of what was, but of what never came. But I no longer let those aches define my days. I had learned the difference between longing and living. One pulls you backward, the other moves you forward with both hands open. In mid-October, the local paper ran a short piece on my book. Nothing grand, just a modest write-up in the lifestyle section with a black and white photo and a quote they'd pulled from the back cover. But that one column changed everything. I started receiving invitations, radio interviews, podcasts, even a small feature for a national magazine focused on aging and reinvention. I turned most of them down. Fame was never my aim, but I said yes to a few. the ones that felt like conversations rather than spotlights. During one such interview, the host asked me what I would say to the version of myself who was asked to leave her own home. I paused, letting the question settle. Then I said, I would tell her not to beg, not to plead, that the moment they told her she was in the way, they had given her the greatest gift of all: permission to build something far better on her own terms. The clip went viral, as they say, not in the way celebrities do, but in the quiet corners of the internet where women share links like lifelines. And in that echo chamber of awakening, I felt less alone. Still, I stayed grounded. I planted tulip bulbs for the spring. I organized my pantry. I took long walks by the lake, letting the cold wind bite at my face, just to remind myself I was still here, still strong, still choosing this life every single day. Thomas came by less often, not because we grew apart, but because we had grown into ourselves. Love, we discovered, didn't require proximity, just presence. He sent letters, left apples on my porch, once mailed me a poem he copied by hand. It was enough, more than enough. And so the season turned, and I with it, not back to who I had been, but forward into something deeper. The world outside was shedding what it no longer needed, and so was I. And for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to live fully. Not as a mother, not as a wife, not as a victim or survivor, but as a woman alone and completely whole. By November, the trees stood bare against a silver sky, their branches stretched like open hands, not begging, just receiving. The wind moved differently now, not with the reckless heat of summer or the sleepy rustle of autumn, but with a kind of clean sharpness, as if everything unnecessary had been stripped away, and what remained was only what mattered. I found myself moving the same way, slower, leaner, and with more intention. I no longer filled the silence with movement. I let it rest around me like a second skin. Inside the house, the season made itself known in quiet ways. The creak of the floorboards beneath heavier socks, the kettle always warm, books stacked near every chair. I spent less time online and more time with my hands, kneading bread, stitching loose seams, writing with pen on paper. Not because I had to, but because it grounded me. Everything I did had become a conversation between myself and the life I had chosen. I was no longer trying to prove anything, not even to myself. The book had done well, better than anyone expected. Not a bestseller, not flashy, but consistent. Word of mouth carried it far beyond our quiet town, and letters still came weekly. Women from all walks of life wrote to tell me how they had made changes, large and small. One left a marriage after 40 years. Another reclaimed a room in her home just for herself. A third started walking every morning at dawn, no longer waiting for permission to begin. Each story was a testament, not to me, but to the simple power of being told, "You are allowed." And yet, I stayed humble to the quietness of my days. That success, that gentle ripple my words had caused, didn't change my world. It only deepened it. I still swept the floor each morning. I still knelt to tie my boots before walking the trails behind the house. I still lit the same candle when I wrote. These routines were my anchor. Not because they were ritualistic, but because they reminded me of the difference between doing and being. I had a visitor one afternoon, unexpected and unsettling. It was my eldest son, Daniel. He appeared at the gate in a navy coat, hands jammed into his pockets, a hesitant smile on his face like someone approaching a skittish animal. I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years, not since the wedding. Not since he stood in the corner and said nothing when I was asked to leave. That silence had carved something deep between us, and I hadn't known whether it would ever close. I opened the door. He stepped inside slowly, as if afraid the house might reject him. "I didn't come for money," he said, before I could speak. "I came because I read your book, and I recognized myself in ways I didn't like." We sat across from each other in the small kitchen. I poured tea. He added honey, too much, just like when he was a boy. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I let you go. I didn't fight for you. I thought I was being neutral. But I see now that silence isn't neutral. It's just consent in disguise." I didn't offer comfort. I didn't rush to absolve him. I simply listened. And when he was done, I said, "We can't change what's already planted, but we can decide what we water going forward." He nodded. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. But when he left, I knew something had shifted. Maybe not a full reconciliation, but a seed. And that, I had learned, was enough. That night, I walked down to the lake with a blanket over my shoulders. The moon was low and heavy, and the water reflected it in ripples of soft light. I thought of everything that had led me here: the betrayal, the exile, the silence, the rebuilding. I no longer needed a story to explain it all. I only needed to be present inside the life it had created. I sat on a flat rock near the edge and whispered aloud, "Thank you for leaving me behind." Not to Emily, not to Harold, not even to fate, but to the version of myself that had once believed survival required staying small. Because I was no longer small. I was vast, quiet, rooted, and nothing, not loss, not absence, not time, could take that from me again. December arrived quietly, as if asking permission to settle in. The frost came first. Subtle silver trails across the porch railing, the edges of windows breathing fog in the early hours. Then the snow followed, soft and deliberate, blanketing the fields and rooftops with a hush that made every sound feel reverent. I had always thought of winter as an ending, but now I saw it differently. Not a death, but a gathering. The way the earth pulls everything inward, protects what matters, and waits. The cottage felt especially still in winter. The walls held warmth longer, the rugs muffled my steps, and the scent of dried herbs hung in the air like memory. I began to bake more often, not because anyone expected it, but because it filled the house with life. I found joy in the rhythm of slow things: kneading dough, stacking firewood, writing by lamplight with a blanket over my lap. My life was no longer marked by accomplishment or even recovery. It was shaped by attention. The final paperwork arrived mid-December: the trust, the land designation, the charitable foundation bearing my name. My attorney, meticulous and discreet, had handled every detail with care. I signed each document slowly, deliberately, aware that every stroke of the pen was a quiet act of authorship. There would be no revisions, no heirs to contest. What I had built would live where I placed it, untouched by the hands that once pushed me aside. There was a ceremony of sorts, not public, not celebrated. I burned the last of my old records that night: mortgage papers from the house I left, the insurance policies I'd once shared with Harold, the copy of the will where my daughter's name had once been penciled in. Not out of spite, but because none of it had relevance anymore. The story had changed, and I no longer needed reminders of a version of my life that had ended without me noticing. It was around that time that I received a letter from a woman named Denise, a name I didn't recognize. She had read my book through a prison reading program, and in a hand that wobbled across the page, she wrote, Your story reminded me that it's not too late to choose something better, even if the world says you've already used up your chances. I read that letter 5 times. I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. Because in that one line, she had named what I hadn't fully admitted, that I had once believed my usefulness, and by extension, my worth, had an expiration date. That if I wasn't cooking or babysitting or deferring, I wasn't earning my place in the world. That being older meant being invisible unless I worked twice as hard to be convenient. But she saw something else, and so did I. On the morning of the 23rd, I walked the lake trail one last time before the deepest snow came. The wind stung my cheeks. The trees groaned softly beneath their icy coats. But I felt no urgency. I walked slowly, every step deliberate, every breath a mark of being. I stopped at the clearing, the one near the center where the pines grew in a perfect half circle, and stood for a long time without moving, not searching, just acknowledging. This land, once dismissed as worthless, now held everything I valued: silence, continuity, decision. I returned to the cottage as the snow began to fall. Inside, I lit a fire, made tea, and opened the final box of author copies. I selected one and placed it into a manila envelope, addressed to a community centre I had never visited, but had donated to anonymously. I slipped a note inside. For the woman still waiting to begin. Let this be her sign. There would be no grand conclusion, no full circle, no dramatic reckoning or televised apology, because life didn't tie itself in bows. It moved in ripples, quiet and steady, and the best you could do was keep your hands open when the next one came. That evening, as night pulled across the sky like a curtain, I sat at my desk and wrote one last line in my journal. Not to record the day, not to preserve a thought, but to name something that had taken me years to understand. I was never in their way. They were simply never meant to walk beside me for the whole journey. And now, finally, I was walking on my own, without shame, without fear, and without looking back.